we know that the three wealthiest people in this country now have the same amount of net worth as the bottom half of the population. It was just announced that the richest three people in America have about $1 trillion now worth of assets. That is clearly not the result of hard work and effort. I mean, one of those individuals, the wealthiest man on the planet, makes cars that kill people in self-driving mode regularly. He's had multiple violations of the law, multiple safety violations. He has rockets that blow up before they get where they're going to go, at least 1/3 of the time. And yet everybody acts like he's a genius. He hasn't actually, of course, created anything. He didn't create any of the products. He's not an engineer who made anything. He just hired people, and he's made a lot of money with the hype and the PR that he generates. So that's not talent. That's not merit.
Hello guys, welcome once again to the channel. I believe wherever you are, you're having some great time. Now, it has been sold over the years that America is the land of the free, and it is a place where everybody gets an equal opportunity. But is this the case? Because sometimes when you look at the disparity that exists between different racial groups, you wonder why there are certain races that are very, very poor, and then there is some race that is very, very rich. This is the case also with wealth gap in America. You find that there is a group of people who are very wealthy, and then there is a group of people who are very poor. Why is this disparity existing? To help us understand this is Tim Wise. He is a well-known speaker who has spoken about the issues of race and diversity in America. And he was in an interview that is quite interesting. Let's watch this, then come back and share our thoughts.
I think the best example of how privilege has functioned in my life is the fact that I'm sitting here with you and having an opportunity to chat with you about this, and all those things that you said in the setup, the bio, those accomplishments, all of that is connected to the various identities that I inhabit as a straight white cisgender male. Not to say that I'm not good at what I do. I'd like to think that I am. I think that I have something valuable to say and to add to the conversation. I'm a decent writer. I run my mouth pretty well. But the reality is that in the absence of all of those identity markers, the odds are very, very good that I would not be in the position that I am in, being taken as seriously as I am taken for doing anti-racism work. When I began this, we were joking before everybody else came on the call. I've been doing this for 30 years on the road lecturing, 35 years in all. How often do white people in their mid-20s gain national prominence for speaking out against racism? Now, on the one hand, I mean, it's not like there's a lot of white folks that are even competing for that gig, right? But when we do, when we put ourselves out there, we are going to receive an inordinate outsized amount of attention, in part because of the rarity of it, but also because it is easier, let's be honest, for a lot of white folks to hear anti-racist messages from someone who has this aesthetic. I'm very aware of that, and acknowledging that doesn't diminish whatever talent I have. It doesn't take away whatever effort and ability that I have, but it's just to say that there are a lot of other folks out there, Black and brown folks, who have every bit as much ability, talent, intellect, and insight, probably quite a bit more insight than I have on racism, since they live with that every day, who are not afforded, certainly not at a young age, as readily as I was and as quickly as I was, the platform that I received. In terms of why I made the decision to do this work, everybody will always tell you, well, I didn't really choose my career, the career chose me, and that's a bit cliche. But at the same time, if I actually think about my life and I think about the things that led up to the decision for me to do this work on a full-time professional basis, it does seem as though there was a certain degree of inevitability to it. I grew up in a home where I was raised with a certain set of values. I went to preschool at a historically Black college where I was subordinated to Black authority early on, which meant in early childhood, I was being taught to respect Black authority, which is indispensable 20 some odd years later when I began doing community organizing, because I already have a default position of trusting what Black people tell me, and specifically Black women, who were the teachers in that early childhood ed program. And then later, the majority of the people that I was working with as an organizer. I also went to schools where, because of that early childhood ed experience and the closeness that I had with my Black friends, when they were treated differently than I was treated, whether that was discipline, whether that was being tracked into lower track academics, even though they were every bit as bright as I was, I noticed it in a way that I think a lot of other white folks wouldn't have, because it wasn't their friends. They didn't have the connection that I had with those black kids, because I had gone to Tennessee State for preschool and most of the white kids had not. Um, and so I think there was just there was like a framework, and there was a cornerstone of understanding and experience. And so then when I go to college in New Orleans at Tulane University, which is a black city, but a white plantation institution in the middle of a black city, I'm again going to notice certain things. And then when I graduated in 1990, having noticed the disparity between the campus and the city, and Tulane was sort of the whitest place that I'd ever been. And it was very it was odd for me. It was difficult for me. That's at the very same time that David Duke, lifelong white supremacist former Klan leader, is running for the U.S. Senate and governor, and I was active in the campaigns against him, ultimately the associate director of the main organization founded for the purpose of defeating him. So I think the timing, my background, my experience, just sort of everything sort of points to this as a direction for me. And so I'm any one of those things not in the picture, I might be doing something very, very different. But I made that choice because it felt like after David Duke ran, and yes, he lost, but if, for those who are old enough to remember, he got 6 out of 10 white people to vote for him. And that was really the moment where, for me, and I think a lot of other people who were involved in that campaign, we realized we had a unique obligation to go and talk specifically to other white people, to move them away from white supremacy and racism, because who else is going to do that? Whose job is it to? It's not black folks' job to save white people from ourselves, right? It's not black folks' job to constantly be the ones teaching us what's wrong with racist thinking. And it just struck me that after the Duke stuff had happened in 90 and 91, that was a pretty good place for me to put my energy.
Wonderful. Thank you for those insights. So you have challenged the idea that America is a meritocracy where hard work guarantees success. Conservative politicians and pundits continue to perpetuate the Horatio Alger myth. This myth suggests that each of us is judged solely on his or her own merit, that we each have a fair opportunity to develop those merits, and ultimately merit will prevail. So this myth encourages people to overlook the many barriers to racial equality that litter the social landscape. And in your work, you have highlighted how systemic racism, historical injustices have given white people generational advantages while marginalizing communities of color. So how do you approach this work in a way that encourages white people to acknowledge this unjust reality in our culture and society?
Well, I think strategically, the way you start to have that conversation with folks, because we are so bought into that notion of meritocracy and rugged individualism, because it seems like it's an empowering narrative. We want to believe it. I get it. I understand why somebody would want to believe it, because it makes them feel as though they're the captain of their ship, right? That they're in charge of what happens. And we all want to have that sense of power. But deep down, I think everyone understands that's not really how it works, right? We know, for instance, putting race aside for a second, we know that the 3 wealthiest people in this country now have the same amount of net worth as the bottom half of the population. It was just announced that the richest 3 people in America have about $1 trillion now worth of assets. That is clearly not the result of hard work and effort. I mean, one of those individuals, the wealthiest man on the planet, makes cars that kill people in self-driving mode regularly. He's had multiple violations of the law, multiple safety violations. He has rockets that blow up before they get where they're going to go, at least 1/3 of the time. And yet everybody acts like he's a genius. He hasn't actually, of course, created anything. He didn't create any of the products. He's not an engineer who made anything. He just hired people, and he's made a lot of money with the hype and the PR that he generates. So that's not talent. That's not merit. And I think most people know that. Even the ones who might like him or like his politics now have to acknowledge that he's not, thousands and thousands of times smarter than the average person. It's just not the case that the wealthy, for instance, have increased their brain size in the last 20 years so as to justify all that extra stuff that they have obtained as a share of the national wealth. So there's a financial system, there's an economic system that steers a disproportionate share of the goodies into the hands of very few. We understand that economically if we think about it for just a second. And all I'm suggesting is we got to acknowledge that with regard to race as well. And we got to acknowledge that with regard to sex and gender, right? We have to acknowledge that with regard to these areas where we know historically certain groups have had disproportionate power and access and others have not. And again, that's not to say that the white folks, for instance, in this country who have obtained a measure of success haven't worked hard. I have no doubt. My great grandfather, for instance, came here as an immigrant in the early 1900s from Russia with the proverbial 18 cents and a ball of lint in his pocket, right? And he worked 18 hours a day, typical immigrant story, but his hard work was also met with an opportunity structure that was off limits to Black and brown folks in that moment. Even his ability to immigrate to the United States at that time was contingent on being European. Had he been anything but, he would not have been able to come at the time that he did because of immigration restrictions that were in place at that time. So two things can be true. You can work really hard, and certainly hard work is more likely to pay off than not hard work, but some have had access to the opportunity structure and others have not. So I try to get white folks to think about those areas where we know that's true. Economics, we understand it, whether it's those three, multi-billionaires now combined, trillionaire trio of the three, or whether we're talking about just the wealthiest 0.1% generally, or the wealthiest 1%, which have, in 1976, the wealthiest 1% of Americans had about 26% of the financial wealth. Now it's a little over half of the financial wealth. Well, the wealthiest 1%, the wealthiest, 3 million or so people did not double their work product. They're not working 80 hours a week now, whereas they used to work 40. Their brains did not evolve faster than everyone else's. We understand it. And so if we can start there, at a place that I think most people recognize, then we can start to extrapolate into these other areas and acknowledge that the history of racial inequity, the history of gender inequity doesn't stop and reset like a video game. There's inertia. It's applying Newton's first law of motion, if you will, to the socioeconomic universe, right? Inertia isn't just a physical property. It's a political, social, economic, historical property. That which happens in one generation affects the next and the next and the next, until and unless that inertia is met with a force of equal or greater power that can arrest its forward trajectory. We have to be that power. And if we are not applying that pressure, that inertia will continue, and indeed it has.
Wonderful. Thank you. You have communicated in your talks about the importance of listening to and amplifying the voices of people of color. You have shared how your understanding of race and privilege deepened through relationships with mentors and colleagues from BIPOC communities. Yeah. Is there a specific example of a relationship with a mentor or colleague that you would like to highlight to help inform your worldview?
Yeah, I mean, there are several I could talk about. I guess the most sort of pivotal and instrumental, both in terms of the longevity of it, but also the timing of it, was relatively early on. I had done that work in the anti-David Duke campaigns, and when I began doing community organizing in New Orleans around in and around public housing, we were working on a lot of different issues, both at the state level and federal level legislation, and organizing communities around certain proposed bills in the State House and in DC. Most of the folks I was working with in those communities were Black folks, and the organization that I worked for was a group called Agenda for Children. And what was fantastic about this group was that they had built into their hiring and promotion and training and everyday operations a close relationship with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, Ron Chisholm and others down in New Orleans, who had been doing and really leading the anti-racism training for a lot of nonprofits and for schools and even some businesses throughout the 80s and into the 90s. And their relationship with the Institute necessitated, it required anyone who worked for the organization had to go through the training and ultimately was accountable to a board that was predominantly people of color, and all of them sort of on the same page, understanding how systemic racism works and was working in the communities where we operated. And that relationship, with Ron and Barbara Major and other folks at the Institute, both Black folks at the Institute and some of the white folks at the Institute who were trainers, was critical, because it meant that when I went into a public housing community, I was brought in, first of all. They didn't just turn the 26-year-old white guy, loose in a community to just go and, do smart things and help people. Got enough people doing that. But I was brought into the community, and one of the people who brought me into the community, who also worked at Agenda for Children was a woman, Donna Jonigan, who was the office manager actually at Agenda for Children. She sort of kept everything running. And she lived in public housing. So she mentored me. She brought me in. She was also trained, of course, by the Institute, brought me into the community, introduced me to the community, vouched for me, which was very kind of her to do because I'm not sure that I deserve that yet. But she had a real confidence in me to be able to come in and work with, not for, to do with, not for the community. And it made just a huge difference. It was very humbling, right? Because you grow up in this country, and I don't care how liberal you are, how progressive you are, what your politics are, and how much sociology you've studied, there are still things that are planted in all of our minds about the capacity of people who are desperately poor, as many of the people that I worked with happen to be. There's still a mentality of judgment, an assumption of capacity, and an assumption that they don't have the knowledge and wisdom that you have because you went to this big fancy university. But I learned more from not just the People's Institute folks, not just Donna, but the people that I worked with in public housing, very few of whom had college degrees, many of whom had not finished high school, but they taught me things about the way that the system in this society works, the economic system and the racialized nature of that system. They taught me things that professors had never been able to teach me, right? And because of being subordinated in that structure to that authority. And I would go back to what I said before too, having those women in preschool as some of my earliest authority figures, I was lucky enough to be in a position to receive that wisdom. And I'm eternally grateful for it.
Love those insights. You have examined the ways that class and race intersect, pointing out that economic inequality disproportionately impacts communities of colors. However, you've also critiqued efforts to reduce racism to purely class-based issues, arguing that race operates independently in many ways. So in light of the persistence of the racial housing gap, income gap, and wealth gap, how do you make the case to bankers that they have a moral imperative to address some of these long-standing economic inequities?
I mean, to me, I think the moral necessity of it is that I actually believe that most people are pretty good folks who don't want to contribute to the suffering of other people. I mean, I think there are certain people who are just cruel and probably horrible folks, but I think that's rare. I think most people really don't want to be implicated in or contribute to the harm of others. And yet, if you inherit the legacy of a harmful structure, if you inherit that inertia that I referenced earlier, you are by definition caught up in it. And it doesn't matter what your good intentions are in that moment. It doesn't matter that you oppose that system that created that inertia. It doesn't matter that if you could go back in time and undo it, you would, because you can't. All you can do is sort of deal with it as it exists right now. And that means taking responsibility for the world as you find it. I think a lot of the morality of it is the same, and it's both a moral and practical argument. It's the same as the way that I come to, therapy, right? I'm in therapy, and my therapist says I should always tell people I'm in therapy because I guess that's therapeutic to say that or something. But in therapy, and I don't want to equate anti-racism to therapy. That's not the analogy, but just stick with me for a sec. The thing about therapy when you do it is you understand you're not doing it so that you feel bad about the things you've done. If you've treated people badly and you've inherited that from maybe your family, and you had certain experiences that damaged you, and created dysfunction. You don't go to therapy so the therapist can make you feel like crap about it. You don't go there so that they can say you're a bad person, and you just need to change and stop. You go so that you can understand the legacy you inherited. You can understand the dysfunction that was handed to you by parents, perhaps, who had it handed to them by parents, who had it handed to them by parents. The whole point of going and seeking help like therapy is to try to break certain cycles. That is both practical for any individual who is in therapy, but it is also a moral requirement, because if you don't do it, you will visit that same damage upon your children, upon your friends, upon your colleagues, upon yourself. And so both morally and practically, learning to accept responsibility for the world as you find it, even though you're not responsible for having created it, is a sign of emotional maturity that we as individuals need to take on, but that we collectively also need to take on. And I think if we think about it that way, we can move from this thinking that some have, which is that, you know, anti-racism is predicated on making white people feel guilt, to something very different, which is saying, no, it's about making all of us feel a certain degree of responsibility and accountability for having received it and what we do with it now. And I think if we can do that, this conversation can become a lot less fraught, and I think people can at least hear what's being said without feeling as though they're being accused of somehow being bad people. You can't help but inherit the legacy of your messed up family if you're raised in one. You can't help but inherit the legacy of a messed up society if you're raised in one. That's not the question, right? The question is, what are we going to do about that? And that's true about race. That's true about gender. That's true about class status. It's true about disability. It's true about sexual orientation, gender identity, any of the categories where some have been elevated and others have been marginalized. All of those things have created inertia, and we need to take some level of responsibility for how we address each of them moving forward.
Amazing. Thank you for those nuggets. Tim, you have advocated for white people to take active roles in anti-racist work. You believe that it's vital that white allies challenge racism in their communities, workplaces, and institutions, and to use their privilege to effect change. For those new to anti-racist work, what does this look like in practice?
I think it's gonna look like different things for different people, and it's very much contingent upon the spaces that a given white person inhabits. You know, if a white person is a parent of children in school, that may mean being very active in assessing, paying very close attention to assessing, and then taking action around racial inequities in the school that your kid attends. In your workplace, depending on what your job is, it can mean being very active in and very proactive in trying to create structures and policies and practices and procedures that are generative of greater equity, greater representation, greater inclusion, as opposed to practices, policies, and procedures which tend to replicate inequities, often without intent, but nonetheless replicating inequities. I think, you know, it'll depend on the community that a person lives in. So I always tell white folks, whatever community you're in, learn the particular racial history of that neighborhood, of that zip code, of that city or town, of that state. Right. We all have different histories. I happen to live in Nashville, Tennessee. I was born and raised here, and with the exception of 10 years in New Orleans, this is really where I've spent all of my life. So if I'm going to do effective work here, I have to understand the very specific history of Nashville, Tennessee, of Davidson County when it comes to race, and even down to the neighborhood level. Like, you know, why does this neighborhood that I'm living in look this way and this other neighborhood looks this way? Why are Black folks disproportionately on this side of town and white folks disproportionately on this side of town? Those are the kind of conversations that wherever you live, right, there's a very specific history. And by learning that history, it becomes possible to then join with others to figure out how can we create not only dialogue around that, but policies, practices, and procedures to address some of that specific history in the workplace, in schools, in housing, with regard to police and public interaction and the criminal justice system. All of those things can become more apparent to us if we learn that history. But I think a lot of times, you know, we sort of start with the macro history, or if you live outside, well, actually, I would argue if you live outside the South, you learn about my history as a Southerner, because it's easier for y'all that are not here to talk about what we did, you know, and we're really aware of what we did. We're very, you know, that's the good thing about being the losers of that war is we never allowed to forget. And I'm not saying that we should be. I'm glad we lost that war. But I think a lot of folks outside the South, right, think that, oh, well, racism is that thing that they do, or it's, and I think, you know, people know better. They know there's racism on the West Coast. They know there's racism on the East Coast. But I do think that we've tended to teach it in a way that has held my people up for the greatest scorn, the Southerners. They're the ones who are the really bad ones. And we had some bad stuff too, but they were the really, really bad ones, as opposed to understanding wherever they are, there is this racialized history of anti-Blackness. There's a racialized history of anti-indigeneity. There's a racialized history in much of this country, obviously, with regard to the exploitation of Asian labor, especially Chinese folk on the railroads. There's a history of exploitation of Latino folks, including the theft of half of Mexico in a war of aggression that this nation started on false pretense. I mean, wherever you are, there is a very specific history. And so I always encourage folks to start there and then fan out rather than starting with the big picture. I have a buddy of mine, my best friend since we're like 5 years old. He's a professor at Cal State Los Angeles. And he talks about how, when he's working with teachers who are going to be teaching in the LA Unified School District, and he says sometimes they're starting, when they start talking about race, they start with like the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and he says, well, I get it. I mean, that's what the textbooks have, right? So we'll start with Dr. King, or we'll start with the abolition struggle, but the racial history of Los Angeles is a very specific racial history. It might actually be more helpful in his mind, and I agree with him, to start with the specific racialization of Los Angeles and of California, and then work backward to connect it to Southern segregation, to connect it to enslavement. Start where people are, right? Not 100. We just like to do history linear, though. And because we do it linearly, we start at the beginning, so to speak, and then we move forward. Sometimes you need to start where you are right now and work backwards, so you begin to see the connections in your own life and actually connect to what those young people in LA Unified are experiencing. Only about 7 or 8% of whom are Black. She's got a lot of Latino kids and Asian kids who need to also understand what's going on in their community, and Black folks who need to talk about what's going on with anti-Blackness in Los Angeles. They don't need to start in Birmingham. That's not the place to start.
Yeah, I love those practical insights there. So this is kind of like a follow-up question, Tim. So what does it look like for an organization like our bank and foundation to begin functioning and operating actually as an anti-racist organization?
Well, I think that in order to operate and function that way, you have to be prepared to hold everything up for interrogation, and leave no stone unturned. And I mean every policy, practice, and procedure in terms of your daily operations, from hiring, recruitment, promotion, to the actual operations of the institution itself and how you interact with the community. And that may seem obvious, but I don't know that institutions always do it. They do some training. They might do implicit bias training, for instance, so people get an awareness of their own internalized stereotypes and biases toward various groups, which is fine. There's value to that, but they're not necessarily interrogating the daily practices, because so oftentimes in the workplace, and so oftentimes with financial institutions, and so oftentimes with educational institutions, and so oftentimes with corporate structures of any kind, even nonprofit structures, even nonprofits that have, really progressive value systems, any institution tends to get used to its own procedures, and you just start taking things for granted. You take for granted the way that you look at your day-to-day operations. You take for granted the standards that you use to assess people for positions within the institution, for judging their work product, for whatever it is you're doing. So if you're a lender and you have certain criteria and you have certain practices, if you're a teacher, you have certain practices. If you're a law enforcement official, you have certain practices. If you're a doctor, a nurse, you have certain practices. And after a while, unless you're reviewing those and thinking critically about them every year. I mean, it can't be something you do once every 5 years or 10 years. You have to be regularly reassessing those things to determine, are these things that we're taking for granted helping us? Or are they hurting us? Are they moving the ball forward? Or are they keeping us sort of, in place, or even moving backward? And I think that regular assessment process is the thing that's going to allow you to then see, okay, what are the new policies that we might want to integrate? What are the new practices that we might need to integrate? Ultimately, the test of whether or not you're able to function as an anti-racist institution is how much self-reflection you're doing, how much self-awareness do you have, not just as individuals, but as an institution, but also what are the changes that you're seeing in the community that you're serving? Because fundamentally, if you have a certain purpose and function and you look in the community and you don't see that purpose and function being fulfilled, then there's obviously a disconnect. And there's only two possible explanations. Either number one, you weren't really as committed as you said you were, which I don't think that's usually it. I think most of the time, if people say, here's our mission, here's our purpose, here's our vision, that they mean it. I don't think people say it just to say it. I think most of the time people intend for it to be real. But if it's not happening, if the changes that the goals that you had, for instance, are not being met, the changes that you hope to see are not coming about, then if it's not that the commitment was phony, then it must be that whatever policies, practices, procedures you had in place to make that goal happen were inadequate to the task. So what are the new procedures, policies, and practices that might help you get to the place that you were trying to go? And it's just being willing to have the humility to acknowledge the shortcoming, right? Because we sometimes, I think we all get caught up in our sense of goodness and righteousness. We're good people. We're trying to do good things. You've got a mission and vision and value statement that's incredibly positive and inspiring, and you know what you're trying to do. And then if you don't do it, it's almost like if you acknowledge that you failed, you feel like you're calling into question your own decency. And that's not what it is. It's simply a matter of saying that no matter how well intended we are, we can all fall short. And unless we are prepared to be humble enough to admit that we didn't quite know how to do it, and we got to go back to the drawing board, if we're not able to do that, then I think that we end up getting burned out. We end up giving up. We end up thinking, gosh, maybe this equity thing is just too difficult. Maybe this wasn't such a great idea, rather than realizing, no, it's just that systems are really deeply embedded. And our way of doing things is really deeply embedded. And it took hundreds of years to create the structure of inequality. Why in the world would we assume that it was just going to take a few years to undo it? Right?
Right. Amazing. Thank you for that. So, Tim, drawing from your book, Dear White America, how can banks or any organization actually navigate resistance to D&I efforts among employees who feel left out or threatened by these initiatives?
I think that the most important thing is to try to meet people where they are. And by that, I mean, I realize, and this is part of my humility that I've had to operate on for several years. I realize that there are ways that we sometimes speak about these things. Those of us who've done it for a long time and are really deep in it, that can be hard for newbies, if you will, to process. I understand that. Same way that if I was an expert mathematician, which God knows I am not, if I were to sit down with someone who barely knew, long division and tried to do trigonometry with them, it wouldn't matter that I understand the trigonometry if I can't make them understand it, right? And so I've got to learn how to speak in a way that can be heard by people who are at a different point on the journey. And sometimes I think what we who are progressive do is we speak to people the way we want to be spoken to. And we want to be spoken to with a lot of evidence and a lot of facts and a lot of here's the way it is. And by God, it's very black and white and very binary thinking. But the reality is most people just haven't thought about this at any real depth. And white people in particular have been encouraged not to think about it. White men especially have been encouraged not to think about it. Anytime you're a member of a dominant group, you have the luxury of having been insulated from the discomfort of having to even deal with this stuff at all. So who do I get mad at for that? Do I get mad at the person who's at the 101 level and are they the problem? No. See, the problem is the system that didn't require more of them. The system's the problem. They're not the problem. If that's true, then I've got to be soft on people and hard on systems. So that if I'm talking to somebody about the need to make some changes on behalf of DEIA efforts, I've got to recognize that person, to them, I might as well be speaking like a language from Neptune, right? And I can't get frustrated by the fact that they don't get the most basic thing that I'm saying, because of course not. That ignorance has been cultivated. So instead of taking it out on them, it's a matter of being soft on them, being willing to struggle with them by remembering that there was a time before I understood it too. Right? All of us had a time before we know whatever it is we know now. And the worst thing that we can do is talk to people on, and shame them on a Friday for not knowing the stuff that we only learned on Monday, figuratively speaking, right?
Yeah.
Like if I just learned about some stuff and then I get all radicalized and riled up about injustice and then I'm angry at you because you don't see it. Well, I didn't see it the week before I saw it. And I don't need people to jump down my throat about that. That wouldn't have helped me either. It wouldn't have made me want to join the struggle. So it's about meeting people where they are, realizing that whatever ignorance they manifest is cultivated ignorance. They come by it honestly. It is rarely the result of deliberate cruelty or meanness. At least at first, it can metastasize into that if we don't address it. But most people who are oblivious to this stuff are oblivious because they've been allowed to be oblivious. And I'm not angry at them for their obliviousness. I'm angry at the society that has cultivated it and now left them in a place where they have a hard time having a conversation that really shouldn't be that difficult to have. So it's about having a certain degree of compassion, and it can be very, very difficult. But I think it's important to meet people where they are and to make it clear that the discomfort they have thinking about these topics is like a tax that they pay. They are paying an emotional tax for the privilege that they've received, right? If you're defensive or upset at DEIA efforts and you feel like it's a burden and it's too stressful, well, why? It's because you haven't had to have the conversation before. You are now paying an emotional cost. That is an injury, if you will, that privileged person is paying for the sake of accessing their privilege. And so if you don't want to feel that way anymore, if you don't want to feel that discomfort, if you want to just be able to have a conversation with another adult human being, as equals, you have to get on board this train and get better at it. Just like anything, if you practice it, you get better at it. The first time you try to speak a new language, you're not good at it. The first time you go to the gym and try to do a workout that you've never done before, you're not good at it. The more you do it, the better you get, but you're not going to do it if I don't invite you into the conversation and make you feel as though it is not only for other people's benefit, but for your own benefit as well.
Wonderful, wonderful. You have warned against the dangers of complacency and the belief that racial progress happens inevitably. You argue that sustained efforts and activism are required to dismantle systems of oppression. And given the reality of a second term for Donald Trump and the continued backlash against efforts to improve outcomes for low-resource communities, what does that sustained effort and activism look like to you?
I mean, it could look like a lot of different things. And I think it's important for people to sort of pick their spot, if you will, because we're not all going to do the same thing. There are some people, for instance, who are just not dispositionally the kind of people who go into the streets and protest or go to rally. There's some people that's just not who they are. That doesn't mean there isn't something they can do. Might be on the job, might be at their kid's school, might be at their own school if they're a student. It can be anything from artistic expression to the way that you raise your kids. My mom, who was really instrumental in who I became, was not an activist. She wasn't an activist, but she made certain decisions about how to raise me, certain decisions about what to teach me on her own, certain decisions about what to expose me to that helped create the me that is who I am today. So I think we got to think of activism in a very broad and capacious way. It's not always what we saw in 2020 with 23 million people going into the streets after the murder of George Floyd. That's an important thing. And I think, it's important to do that. But if you're not the kind of person that's going to do that, there are still things that you can do within the workplace, within your neighborhood, within your church or your synagogue or your mosque or whatever it might be, to bring people into a conversation that maybe otherwise they wouldn't come into. And so I don't want us to think of activism as just big sort of epic protest and demonstrations. In fact, I would argue that sometimes that stuff is so predictable that the system is ready for it. Like 23 million people went into the street, but and it was wonderful. But let's be honest, what broad systemic changes have come from that? Broad systemic change has not come from that. But what did come from that? The narrative change. We did start to use language like systemic racism in spaces where it wasn't used before. So it was important, but did it produce massive systemic changes? No. Which is to say that, if 23 million people didn't produce massive systemic change, probably, and that was the biggest uprising in history. The odds of us replicating that again in the near future, very, very small, and God forbid that somebody has to die again for it to happen. But if 23 million didn't do it, 25 probably isn't going to do it. 30 million is not going to do it. What might do it is tens of millions of people, however, putting pressure locally in the spaces where they work, in the places where their kids go to school. If you've got, groups of parents showing up at schools all around this country to demand the removal of books, to demand the banning of curriculum, to demand the shutting down of conversations around systemic racism, around anything related to LGBTQ equality. If you've got parents that are willing to go and spend time doing that, then we as parents had better be there as well, demanding the inclusion of that material, demanding the teaching of honest history, demanding that all the needs of all the students are being met, not just those that are in the dominant groups. And so that's activism. It may or may not make the news, it may or may not be an Instagrammable moment. It may or may not be something that gets a lot of attention, but that's the stuff where change is being made most dramatically. And so I think there are as many possibilities of how to do activism as there are people, but it's about connecting with other folks in your community who are doing a particular thing, adding your voice and your energy to that, and considering that your own version of organizing. Community organizing, we have a traditional model in our head. Activism, we have a traditional model in our head. But anything that you are doing to challenge structures of injustice and inequality is a form of activism.
Wonderful. Love it. Tim, one more question for you, and then we'll open it up for our colleagues. So as a mission-driven, purpose-led, values-based financial institution, banks like Beneficial State can play a pretty significant role in community development and financial inclusion efforts. So how can we better address the needs of underserved and marginalized communities without perpetuating paternalistic or extractive business models?
I think the way that you do that is by trying to make sure that from the very beginning, and in all of your decision making, that those communities that you're seeking to serve are involved in the planning, in the policy making, in the decisions of the institution. Not just that they are served on the back end, but that they are right there at the front end and throughout the process. And I think about that going back to my experience with that nonprofit I mentioned, Agenda for Children, the children and family advocacy group that I worked for in New Orleans in the mid-90s. One of the things that made them most effective, and certainly the thing that held them accountable, was that people, so we were working in public housing. That was the community that we were serving in and around public housing. So very poor zip codes in New Orleans. And people from those public housing communities sat on our advisory boards, sat on our policy boards. They were involved in the hiring decisions. They were involved in the decisions about whether or not the staff would get a promotion, right? They were involved in the day-to-day decisions, which meant that they could take for granted, at least to a greater extent, that what we were doing was really in their interest because they were involved in the process, as opposed to some other nonprofits that we worked with and some of the corporate entities that we partnered with on some occasions, where they would come up with a plan, they would have a program, they might get a grant from a foundation, and the grant would come in and be a 5-year grant, and but nobody from the community that was quote unquote being served had been involved in preparing the grant, had been involved in, or the grant proposal had been involved in saying what the needs of the community were. It was just, you had these foundations that were showering money on other organizations or even corporate entities to do various things. And there was no accountability. There was no involvement from the start. And then what would happen is 3 years later, 5 years later, the foundation would, the money would run dry. They wouldn't renew the grant because they didn't see the progress that they hoped to see. Well, of course not, because the people in the community didn't trust the effort because they weren't part of it from the beginning. So all of a sudden you had folks showing up with clipboards and questionnaires and, wanting to talk to people in the community about their needs. And, for at least the first year, the community's looking at them like, who are you again? Like, I've never seen you in my life. Whereas if that community had been involved from square one, right, they would have known, oh yeah, this is the so-and-so organization or so-and-so company. This is what they're doing. I was there when they started. Here's what they're about. And then the community starts to gain a certain degree of trust. So I think it's about making sure that the population being served or ostensibly being served is in on the decision-making process from the beginning and has some authority over the people who are going to be quote unquote doing the work. I also think about that with regard to the school that I attended. I attended Tulane, as I said, and after Katrina came through in 05, I was long gone by then. But after that, the school sort of rebranded itself, right? And I was somewhat cynical about it, branded as the campus that cares, or the college that cares. And they had a service learning requirement that they created. And I remember going down there for a speech some years after that. And I asked people, I said, well, when you do service learning, what does that look like? It's like, well, we go in and we do literacy training for, kids in the New Orleans schools, or we go in and, we do some drywall in the housing. We do housing rehabilitation. We do all these things. And I said, okay, well, and then they get a grade for that. Like that, like they go in, they do a service project, and then they get a grade. And I said, okay, well, who determines the grade that you get? Like who ultimately grades you? And they said, well, the professor that we do the work through. So if it's in a sociology department that you're connecting with, it might be the sociology professor, or it could be the English professor. It could be whatever. I said, you're telling me that you go in to serve these desperately poor folk who quote unquote need your help, right? But they don't actually assess you. They don't actually get to tell you whether you did a good job. Like, it seems like they should be giving you the grade, right? Like they should be the ones that are like, yep, that's an A+, or no, that's a C, B-. It seems absurd to me to say that you're going to serve a community, and then that community neither helped to prepare what you were going to do, had any say in what you were going to do, or how you were going to do it, nor did they have the power to hold you responsible if you screwed it up. Right. That's what real accountability looks like. And I think sometimes it's missing. So I would say that's the kind of direction that you'd want to go in and stay in if it's already where you are.
On behalf of the entire team at Beneficial State Foundation and Bank, we are so grateful, so appreciative for your wisdom, your insights, your perspective today. You've been doing this work for a while. We feel, you've given us some really wonderful nuggets to think of in terms of how we approach this work. Wishing everybody safe and happy holidays. Everybody, thank you for joining us. Good luck on your travels, Tim.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
So Tim Wise has emerged as a pivotal figure in advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in America, using his platform as an anti-racist educator and author to confront systemic racism head-on. With a career spanning over 3 decades, Wise has delivered lectures at more than 1,500 colleges and trained professionals across sectors, corporate, government, and education on dismissing racial inequalities. His work emphasizes that DEI isn't just about inclusion, but about uprooting entrenched privilege that perpetuate inequality, particularly for Black Americans. Through books like White Like Me and Dispatches from the Race War, he challenges white audiences to recognize their unearned advantage, framing racism as a systemic issue rather than mere personal bias. His approach aligns DEI with a call for responsibility, urging institutions to shift policies and practices that disadvantage marginalized groups. Wise explanations of Black disenfranchisement in America are rooted in historical and ongoing injustices. He traces the thread from slavery, where Black bodies were commodified for profit, through Jim Crow laws that legally barred Black people from economic and social mobility. He highlights redlining, a practice where banks denied loans to Black neighborhoods, starving them of capital and locking families out of home ownership, a key wealth-building avenue. Wise connects this to modern disparities, like underfunded schools and job discrimination, showing how capitalism often exploited Black labor while denying equal opportunity. He argues that colorblind policies ignore this history, perpetuating gap in education, employment, and housing. By amplifying Black voices and exposing these systemic barriers, Wise has bolstered DEI efforts, pushing for equity as a corrective to centuries of exclusion. His work remains a clarion call for accountability, making him a vital voice in the fight against racial injustices. That is all from me today. Tell me down in the comment section what you think about this. And if you're watching us for the first time, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and also share. Thank you. And may the good Lord bless you. Goodbye.